Tonight should be Le'ilui Nishmas Avram ben Moshe Mezi, and sponsored Le'ilui Nishmaso by his son Moshe Mezi. Neshama should have an aliyah. The first part of Parashas Vayakhel discusses the mitzvah of Shabbos, and the mitzvah of Shabbos is almost an introduction to the continuation of the Torah's description of the binyan ha-mishkan. However, as the Mefarshim point out, there is a large discrepancy, a number of discrepancies between this mitzvah of Shabbos as it's described in the Torah, where the Torah introduces the binyan ha-mishkan of Parashas Vayakhel with the mitzvah of Shabbos, and in last week's parasha, Parashas Kisisa, where the Torah also juxtaposed the binyan ha-mishkan with the mitzvah of Shabbos. So l'chora, the greatest discrepancy between the two parashas, even though in both of them you have a description of the Mishkan juxtaposed to the description of the mitzvah of Shabbos, is that when it comes to Parashas Kisisa, so the binyan ha-mishkan comes prior to the mitzvah of Shabbos. The binyan ha-mishkan introduces the notion of Shabbos. That's what we had at the beginning of last week's parasha, before the Chet HaEgel. So there the Torah has the binyan ha-mishkan, and then from binyan ha-mishkan it goes into Sheishes Yamim Yelsa Melacha, goes into the mitzvah of Shabbos. Whereas when it comes to Parashas Vayakhel, the Torah flips the order. Over here in Parashas Vayakhel, first we have the parasha of Shabbos, and then we have the binyan ha-mishkan. And the question is, why the switch of the ordering? So we've mentioned in the past the mahalach, the approach of the Meshech Chochmah, where the Meshech Chochmah suggests that perhaps the Torah over here is telling us a big chiddush, something which transpired over the course of Chet HaEgel. And that is that even though Rashi seems to indicate that both parashiyos, both in Parashas Kisisa and in Parashas Vayakhel, the juxtaposition is coming to indicate that Shabbos is not to be violated in the course of binyan ha-mishkan, suggests the Meshech Chochmah that that is only true post Chet HaEgel. But in fact, prior to Chet HaEgel, Parashas Kisisa, the description of Shabbos and Mishkan is prior to Chet HaEgel. So prior to Chet HaEgel, in fact, the binyan ha-mishkan would be doicha Shabbos. You'd be allowed to build the Mishkan on Shabbos. And it's only a result of the Chet HaEgel that you can't build the Mishkan on Shabbos. In fact, the Meshech Chochmah says, really one could ask the question, why is binyan and Mishkan not doicha Shabbos? The Avodah Beis HaMikdash and Mishkan is doicha Shabbos. So then building the Mishkan should also be more important than Shabbos and should be doicha Shabbos. Suggests the Meshech Chochmah that no, the purpose of building the Mishkan is to create a situation of Hashras HaShechina. The Avodah Beis HaMikdash is to serve that Shechina, that the Rebbeinu Shalom, after his Hashras HaShechina is there. The service of the Rebbeinu Shalom is doicha Shabbos. But bringing the Rebbeinu Shalom into this world, creating a situation of Hashras HaShechina, is not doicha Shabbos. Prior to Chet HaEgel, the purpose of the Mishkan was not to create Hashras HaShechina. Hashras HaShechina was throughout the Mishkan, throughout the Machane Yisrael. The purpose of the Mishkan was merely a hechsher for the Avodah. Hechsher for the Avodah, that certainly is doicha Shabbos. Post Chet HaEgel, now Klal Yisrael is to build a Mishkan for Hashras HaShechina. So for that, we don't say Shabbos is doicha. For the Avodah, Shabbos is doicha. But to create a situation of Hashras HaShechina, Shabbos is not doicha. That's a suggestion of Meshech Chochmah. But what I would like to focus on is not his reasoning, his explanation, but rather his suggestion that prior to Chet HaEgel, the halacha was that Shabbos would not be doicha Mishkan, that Shabbos would fold, so to speak, in front of the binyan ha-mishkan. You'd be able to violate Shabbos to build Mishkan, and post Chet HaEgel that switched. And the question is, why would that be the case? So to fully understand this, I think we have to take a look at another discrepancy between the parasha of Shabbos in Parashas Vayakhel and the parasha of Shabbos in Parashas Kisisa, pre Chet HaEgel and post Chet HaEgel. Aside from the ordering, that we just noted, there's another major discrepancy, and that is in our parsha, the Parashas Vayakhel, the Torah does something very interesting. Aside from telling us that Sheishis Yamim Tiyasim Melacha, 6 days a week you're going to work, and on the 7th day it's going to be Shabbos, the Torah comes and says, Lo Yisivaru Eish B'chol Moshvei Seichem. We know that in general the Torah doesn't delineate for us the melachas, the isurim of Shabbos. That's something we learn out from Mishkan. There is one exception to that, and that is the isra of leisevaru eish b'chol moshvei seichem. For some reason, precisely over here in Parashas Vayakhel, that's where the Torah decided that it has to explicate this one melacha, leisevaru eish b'chol moshvei seichem. We've had the mitzvah of Shabbos a number of times throughout Torah already. Why specifically when it comes to the parsha of Parashas Vayakhel, that's where the Torah comes and says, aside from the 38 melachas that you learn out from the Mishkan, there's another melacha called Havara, and that one has to be specifically delineated. Lo yisevaru eish b'chol moshvei seichem. Why does lo yisevaru eish b'chol moshvei seichem have to be delineated specifically, and why dafka here? So why it has to be delineated is actually a question of a source of great controversy in the Gemara. The Gemara gives two possibilities. Either lo yisevaru eish b'chol moshvei seichem is chosen to be said explicitly because it is in fact different than other melachas. When it comes to the other melachas, there's a chi of skila. When it comes to the isser of havara, there is only malchus. That is the din that the Gemara says, havara lilav yatzas. It was explicitly stated to say that it's different than the other melachas in that it is a lav. Okay, then we understand why leisivaru eish has to be mentioned explicitly. But then there's another manda amar. The other manda amar says leisivaru eish b'chol moshvei seichem is not lilav yatzas. It wasn't explicitly stated because it's a lav, it's different than all the other melachas, but rather it's teaching us a rule that is in general applicable to all the melachas. It's used as a model for all the other melachas to teach us that the melachas on Shabbos are chiluk melachas. What does it mean, chiluk melachas? Chiluk melachas is a concept as follows. If a person violates many melachas, do we view it as he did many acts of the same isser? He ate many times chazer, he did many acts of the same isser? Or do we view every violation of melacha as one big isser? He violated meleches Shabbos. So when it comes to the melachos of Shabbos, we hold that havara, this Manda Amra holds that havara lechalek yatzas. The reason why havara is explicitly mentioned is to teach us, don't think that all these melachos are one isser, and if a person does zayreya and koitzer and chayrish and Shabbos, he violated one isser. No, each one is a mechayev bifnei atzma. That is why havara is explicitly mentioned, havara lechalek yatzas. Now the question is, if havara lilav yatzas, it teaches that it's a lav, it has to be havara, because havara is the only one that's a lav. But according to the Manda Omar, that havara lechalek yatzas, so then why do we pick havara to be the model for all the other melachas? Any melacha could have taught us lechalek yatzas. I could have said leisacharesh, I could have said leisizra, and that would have taught me that lechalek yatzas, that every melacha is an isser b'fnei atzma. Why is it that the isser of havara specifically, the melacha of havara specifically, is the melacha which is chosen to be pointed out that this is going to teach us that all the melachas are considered to be independent isurim? And I believe that the reason is very, very, very important to understand and very clear. Why havara specifically was chosen to teach us that all the melachas are lechalek yatzas, and that is because the truth of the matter is an isser melacha could come in two forms. An isser melacha could come in the form of where, in fact, there is chiluk melachos, and every melacha on its own is considered to be its own isser. But there are isurei melachas in the Torah where that's not the case, and we don't say chiluk melachos, and every one of the melachas is just considered another manifestation of one broad isser called loisasacha melacha. Where is that the case? That's the case when it comes to Yom Tif. You see, there's a major stark discrepancy between the isser melacha of Shabbos, says the Rambam, and the isser melacha of Yom Tif. The isser melacha of Yom Tif, there's no chiluk chiluk malachas. If I do charisha, zriya, koitzer, it's all violation of one isser called loisasa chomalacha. It's only when it comes to Shabbos where the Torah tells us, no, there's chiluk malachas. Every maisa, every act is a malacha bifnei atzma, is an isser bifnei atzma. Why? Because Yom Tov is zeichel yetzias Mitzrayim. Therefore, the Torah wants us to rest, not be involved in our business, to focus on the Rebbeinu Shalom and Yetzias Mitzrayim. It doesn't matter whether I violate it through Ketzira, Charisha. The point is, I didn't work. So if I do Koitzer, Chayrish, Zayreya, it's all one violation of Losasim Chol Malachas. Shabbos is not only Zeichel Yetzias Mitzrayim. Shabbos is Zeichel and Maisa Bereishis. And Maisa Bereishis means, it's not just the Rebbeinu Shalom wants you to rest. Every malacha of Shabbos corresponds to malacha in the Mishkan. And every malacha in the Mishkan, the Medrash says, was corresponding to a malacha that the Rebbeinu Shalom did in Binyan Abriyas HaOlam. And therefore, every one of the malachas is aser, not just because we want you to rest, the general isser, but every one of the malachas is an isser bifnei atzma because you're violating the zeichel ma'aseh bereishis. The Rebbeinu Shalom rested from the equivalent of Zariah, and you're violating that. The Rebbeinu Shalom rested from the equivalent of Charisha, and you're violating that. Since it's Zeichel Ma'aseh Bereishis, every malacha gets a chashivas bifnei atzma. It's not just I'm not resting, lo sasachom malacha. Every malacha is like its own isser, and therefore there's a concept of chiluk malachas. Every single one is its own isser. On Shabbos there's chiluk malachas because it's Zeichel Ma'aseh Bereishis. On Yom Tov there's no chiluk malachas because it's one isser. I want you to rest. How do I rest? Avoid these 39 things. That's the way to rest. But if I do different malachas, it's just one basic isser that I didn't rest. This is why Shabbos there's chiluk malachas, Yom Tov there's no chiluk malachas. Why did the Torah choose lo sevaru eish b'chol moish v'seichem to be the model through which, the conduit through which I learn chiluk malachas? Because as the Rashbam tells us beautifully, why is lo sevaru eish explicitly mentioned in the Torah al pi derech hapshat? Says the Rashbam, lefi shebiyamim tovim ksiv asher ye'achal l'chol nefesh u'levadi yaseh sham hutra havaras eish. Loisevaru eish is mutter on Yom Tov for the most part, because for cooking and things of that nature. On Shabbos, it is not usher. So what melacha? Shabbos is not mutter. So what melacha is going to be the melacha which teaches me the major difference between Shabbos and Yom Tov? Of course, the melacha that is applicable mostly on Shabbos and mostly not applicable on Yom Tov. That's the melacha of Havara. So what melacha is going to be used to teach me that Shabbos is chiluk melachas, that the nature of the Isser Malacha on Shabbos is quite different than the nature of the Isser Malacha on Yom Tov. That on Shabbos is about Zeichel Ma'aseh Bereishis, every Malacha is a Malacha b'fnei atzma, and on Yom Tov it's Zeichel Yetzias Mitzrayim, and it's all one big Isser called Lo Sasam Malacha. How do I point to this major distinction between the two Malachas? Let me point to Lo Sevaru Eish B'chol Moish V'Seichem. That applies on Shabbos, it doesn't apply on Yom Tov. You don't want to know why? Because on Shabbos the Isser Malacha is quite different than Yom Tov. On Shabbos it's about refraining from the activities that the Rebbeinu Shalom used to create the world. On Yom Tov it's about resting. When it comes to resting, you're allowed to do things that you need to do in the household. So Sevaru Eish is the model of a malacha, which really is the only malacha that could teach us the distinction between Shabbos and Yom Tov, because on Shabbos and Yom Tov it's just about resting. Like Sevaru Eish, you could rest and still cook. On Yom Tov it's about refraining from all the malachas that the Rebbeinu Shalom used to create the world. It doesn't matter whether it's a violation of a rest or not. You have to refrain from all these malacha. The Sevaru Eish teaches you the difference in the nature of the Isser malacha between Shabbos and Yom Tov, and therefore it's that malacha that's going to come to tell you the depth of the distinction, that on Shabbos there's chiluk malachas. Since Lo Sevaru Eish applies, it must be that it's not just about resting. It must be deeper than that. It must be that every single one is an Isser b'fnei atzmo. Says that man the Amar, Lo Sevaru Eish lechalik yasas, to teach you a yisoid. On Shabbos it's not just about resting like it is on Yom Tov. If that were the case, Lo Sevaru wouldn't be aser. If Lo Sevaru is aser, it must be Shabbos is more than that. Shabbos is about refraining from the activities that the Rebbeinu Shalom used in Ma'aseh Bereishis, and therefore Shabbos is chiluk. Havara is different than Zriya, and Zriya is different than Charisha. Charisha is different than Ketzira. It's not just one big don't do malacha. Every malacha is on it to its own isser. The distinction between Shabbos and Yom Tov. Now we begin to understand. Now that we understand the Isser Malacha of Shabbos and how it's different from the Isser Malacha of Yom Tov, I think we could understand why. We certainly understand now why Specifically, this distinction is taught to us in the aftermath of Chet HaEgel. Because what was the mistake of Chet HaEgel? The mistake of Chet HaEgel, like we pointed out many times, Al Pi the Beis Halevi, was as follows. Klal Yisrael used their immense knowledge of what we would call Torah's HaKabbalah, and how to manipulate the world at large, the world HaTachton, and based on the world, the Olam HaElyon. Klal Yisrael understood that they can manipulate these things, and therefore they tried to use that to create an egel which would help them connect to the Rebbeinu Shalom. Ta'u b'zeh ta'us echad. Emes, says the Beis Levi, they were right that they have the ability to make things which could really manipulate the higher spheres and could in fact influence their connection with the Rebbeinu Shalom. The Ge'ega wasn't just a random model of a cow, it was using Torah's HaKabbalah to try to connect to the Rebbeinu Shalom, and they were correct about that. Kulam ki ken gazer habayri yisbar shalamos. The one difference is they made a mistake. You could only use those powers, you could only use that manipulation if there was a gezerah from the Rebbeinu Shalom. If the Rebbeinu Shalom said you're allowed to use it in that way. It only works and it's only allowed to be used if the Torah commands you to do it. And in fact, Klal Yisrael were commanded to use those koichos when building the Mishkan, and that's why the Mishkan was successful in bringing the Hashras HaShechina. The only difference, says the Beis Levi, between the Asiyas HaMishkan and the Egel was one thing: whether there was a tzivoy from the Rebbeinu Shalom. So what was the mistake of the Egel? The mistake of the Egel was not a misunderstanding in the understanding of the world and the Rebbeinu Shalom per se. The mistake of the Egel is that the Rebbeinu Shalom wasn't mitzaveh. Yes, it's very similar to the Kruvim. There's one difference. The Rebbeinu Shalom was mitzaveh the Kruvim and not mitzaveh the Chet Egel, says the Beis Halevi. They made a mistake. They thought that just like they have the ability to build a Mishkan and they have the ability to bring Hashras HaShechina, they could do the same thing with an Egel, and they're correct. Al pi their chachma. The problem was the Rebbeinu Shalom wasn't mitzaveh. What was the mistake of the Chet Egel al pi zeh? The Chet of the Egel al pi zeh was that they were given koichas, and they thought we could use these koichas independent of the Rebbeinu Shalom. They forgot, so to speak, that the Rebbeinu Shalom is the one that gives them these koichas, and therefore they could only use them in line with the way the Rebbeinu Shalom allows them to use them. So when they got the ability, when they got the tzivoy, the Mishkan, according to the Ramban, it came before Egel, they said, oh, look at the koichos we have, and then they got nervous. Moshe Rabbeinu's not here? No problem. We could create our own Moshe Rabbeinu through these koichos that the Rebbeinu Shalom gave us, through this understanding that we have to build the Mishkan. The Rebbeinu Shalom says, you're forgetting one piece. I told you to build the Mishkan, and that's why it works. I didn't tell you to build an Egel, and that's why it is not working. Therefore, the Rebbeinu Shalom made a major transformation. Before Chet HaEgel, Ein HaChanami, the Mishkan would be Doicha Binyan HaShabbos, because, in fact, bringing Karbanos is more important than Shabbos, and the Mishkan would be Doicha Binyan HaShabbos. And that's why the ordering over there is first you have Mishkan, and then you have Shabbos. But after Chet HaEgel, the Rebbeinu Shalom saw that if I don't put a stop to it, if I don't teach them that at the end of the day this is only going to work because I said it's going to work, so then they're going to get carried away. They think they're the ones that are being mekadesh, and therefore we need a Shabbos. The major difference between a Shabbos and a Yom Tov is that Yom Tov were mekadesh. A Shabbos, the Rebbeinu Shalom reminds us, you only have the ability to be mekadesh because I gave you the ability mekadesh. Ani Hashem Mekadesh Chen. And therefore, now the Rebbeinu Shalom says, I'm going to let you build a Mishkan, but every 7 days, you're going to stop to remember that the only reason you're building a Mishkan is because I said to build a Mishkan. And when I say to stop building a Mishkan, you stop building a Mishkan. Because it only works if I'm going to be the one to allow you to be Mekadesh. Don't think you have your own koiches. So specifically in this Parashas, the Torah teaches the difference between Melacha of Shabbos and Melacha of Yom Tov. When it comes to Melacha of Yom Tov, we're Mekadesh Yom Tov, and therefore the Melacha is just about Leisasacha Melacha, not doing Melacha. But when it comes to Shabbos, it's much more than that. When it comes to Shabbos, it's every single Isser. It's an Isser Bifnei Atzma. The Rebbeinu Shalom is reminding us that He created the world and He's the one who invested us with the koach to be Mekadesh. And therefore we only have the koach when He gives us the koach. And that's why specifically in the aftermath of Chet HaEgel, where the Rebbeinu Shalom tells us, no longer could you do this on Shabbos. The Torah has to explain to us, because this Isser Melacha is different than Yom Tov. This Isser Melacha is Lo Yisevaru Eish B'chol Moshe Seichem. It's not just about resting. It's remembering the Rebbeinu Shem created the world. The Rebbeinu Shem gave you the koyach to manipulate the world, and you're only allowed to do it in the way that I give you the permission. You only have the koyach to do it in the way that I invest you with that koyach. This is why all the Mefarshim Rabbi, specifically over here, the Torah uses that Sheishes Yamim Te'aseh Melacha. For 6 days, Melacha should be done. Shouldn't it be like it says earlier in Parashas Yisro? Sheishes Yamim Taseh, you should do. What's Te'aseh? Because Rebbeinu Hashem is reminding us that the Mishkan, 6 days a week, the only reason you're able to do it is because I'm allowing you to do it. It's being done al yedei me. You're not doing anything. Shabbos is there to remind you that even the 6 days a week that you're working, you think you're doing it. You think you're investing it with Kedusha. You think if you want to build an egel, you could build an egel because you're the one who's manipulating it. Now the Rebbeinu Shem says, stop on Shabbos to teach you that even the Mishkan that you're doing, even the Binyan Mishkan that you're building, it's not Tasa, you're not doing it, but rather, it's Te'aseh, it's being done. The Yesod of Shabbos over here in Parashas Vayakhel is to teach us the unique nature of Shabbos, the Isser Melacha, when it comes to Shabbos as opposed to Yom Tov. And that was specifically in the aftermath of Cheder Egel, to teach Klal Yisrael that in fact, even though they are given tremendous koyach to be mekadesh, and that's how they're able to build a Mishkan, don't err like you did at the Egel and think that you have this koyach independent of the Rebbeinu Shem. This koyach comes from the Rebbeinu Shem, who created the world and invested you with that koyach. And if he doesn't invest you with the koyach, and he doesn't mitzvah you to do that, so then you won't have the koyach. That will be turned into a Cheder Egel rather than to a kruvim in a Mishkan.